read a lot about you, but let give us a little bit of a background. I mean, you have a really an absolutely impressive background. I would love for the viewers to just kind of know a little bit about you.
Well, my career-long passion has been in, democracy and democratization and people fighting for their rights, social movements, things like that. And I have a broad interest in the world and those things. And so when I was a graduate student, I was looking around the world for regions to study. And so I wanted somewhere where there's a real revolution going on against authoritarianism. And back then in the late 1980s, the Soviet Union was ground zero of that. So
Hmm.
I decided I wanted to study that region. And I went there. I didn't know any Russian. I didn't know much about Russian culture.
Hmm.
But I went there and discovered this incredible thing, which was this empire of what Reagan called the empire of evil. It wasn't
Hmm.
as evil as Reagan said it was, perhaps, but it was pretty bad. Dissolving, and these democratic movements springing up all over the Soviet Union,
Hmm.
fighting for fighting for democracy and
Hmm.
national independence from Russia in the case of some of the non-Russian republics. And I was hooked. I just thought that was the coolest thing. And so I lived there during the hardest years of the revolution between 89 and 91.
Hmm.
And I really enjoyed that. I also have an interest in, and I've stayed interested in Russia since then,
Hmm.
although for the first 15 years or so, or 10 years at least, of Putin's dictatorship,
Hmm.
Putin's time in office, Russia became kind of an ordinary authoritarian regime.
Hmm.
But in recent years, it's become an extraordinarily authoritarian regime. And so it's gotten a lot more interesting again to
Hmm.
me. But I've studied a lot of other countries. I'm interested in religion and politics. In fact, my last book was on Muslims, and so and I'm interested in kind of Christian Muslim relations and differences, and addressing those questions as well. I've also written books on, national legislatures and how they fit into democracies, and things like that. So I've got really broad ranging comparativist interests. And these days I'm focusing a lot on the United States. And my main topic of focus is fighting the authoritarian menace, fighting Trump and
Hmm.
Putin, Mike Pompeo and Tucker Carlson, and the would-be
Yeah.
dictator of Hungary, Viktor Orban, all these guys trying to figure out how liberal Democrats, I mean liberal in the classic sense of the word as well as progressive, can actually get our act together and fight back. And what you'll see in a lot of scholarly writing is a lot of ideas about how we got into this mess, but not much in the way of prescriptions or realistic remedies. And so I'm trying to make my own little contribution to that now.
Awesome. And I saw that you wrote a book about Russia as well in 2005,
Yes,
right?
several books on Russia. My
Okay.
dissertation book was in 1995, and it was about the revolution there. And then 2005, I published a book that was about the defeat of democracy in Russia, and I tried to explain why that happened.
So, there's obviously a lot going on in Ukraine and Russia right now with like tensions rising by the day. And I just want to hear like what's your baseline analysis of what's going on now, and then I think we can move on to like more detailed questions from there. What do you think is happening right now, and why do you think it's happening? I think one of the biggest things that's been bothering me is that I can't seem to understand why it's happening now.
Well, yeah, it's a good question, and nobody knows exactly why Putin is doing this now. But here's some clues. So Putin's main goal, and he's never made any mystery of this since he came to power, is restoring Russia's greatness in the world.
Hmm.
He said something interesting when he first came to power, and he said, Russia will be great or it will not be. He thinks that a Russia that's not powerful and sovereign, independent of all other powers in the world, runs its own affairs, is destined to die. It's destined to be taken over and parted out among its territories, parted out and distributed among great powers in the world.
Hmm.
So he really, really, in raising Russia's clout in the world, its great power status, which was lost after the Soviet Union fell apart, goes along with that clearly. He's also never pretended not to want the lands of the old Soviet Union to be joined back together. But so far, he hasn't talked about what he's been speaking about recently, which is historic Russia, which is basically Russia even before the Soviet Union came never says exactly what year or decade he's talking about, but if you take 1914, which is the last year where the Russian Empire was as large as it had gotten recently, and it's before the Soviet Union came along in World War I, historic Russia includes all of Ukraine. It includes the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, which were part of the Soviet Union for a while and then are now free states, Belarus, and all of Central Asia, all the stans, Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, all the countries of the Caucasus, Georgia, Azerbaijan, Armenia. And if you look at that map, it includes half of Poland and all of Finland as well. So when Putin starts talking about restoring historic Russia, you know that his ambitions are imperial. Why is he doing this now? Well, during the Trump administration, well, you'd think the Trump administration would be the time to move like this, right? Because he's got basically his own guy in power. Trump is a Putin sycophant. Even now, he's lining up in favor with Putin in favor of the invasion against Ukraine. Trump is a traitor. He's a traitor to the United States, and you would think maybe he'd do it during Trump, but he didn't want to make Trump look bad. He didn't want to embarrass Trump because Trump, just by being in office, by being his stooge in office, by discrediting democracy in the United States, by making Americans think this is what democracy gets you, is Trump. Trump was an invaluable asset to him. So when Trump says this wouldn't have happened if I were president, that might be true, but not in the way that Trump means it. It's not because Trump was so tough with Putin. It's because he was so much Putin's patsy. He was doing Putin's work for him in terms of discrediting democracy, in terms of wanting to pull out of NATO and the Western alliance and dissing our own allies, that Putin didn't want to embarrass Trump. And liberals need to actually get that. And they need to make that they need to message that right now, too. And so what's more, Putin has kind of done everything he could have done. You know, he came to office at a time when oil prices were skyrocketing and the Soviet and Russia was kind of getting over the worst of the old Stalinist economic model and starting to recover. In fact, it started happening, the recovery, even before he got to office. But then he rode that and those astronomical oil prices until about 2007. Russia underwent a lot of economic growth. Since he's not willing to undertake serious economic reforms that might threaten his hold on power, his ability to own and run all these big corporations himself, de facto control all their leaders, he's not willing to allow for, innovation from below, high tech sector that involves the emergence of hundreds of thousands of people who are beyond his control. Since he hasn't been willing to undertake that kind of reform, the Russian economy stagnated. It's really been in the doldrums for the last decade. Russians' incomes have declined by over 20% just in the last 5 years. The economy isn't much of a project for him anymore. He controls the oligarchs. He's kind of got everything under control at home in that respect. He doesn't really care that much about the economy anyway. His big project is what he's undertaking right now. So being out of anything else to do, being isolated by COVID and getting kind of crazier and crazier in his own little silo where he doesn't have that much contact with other people. And also, he's almost 70 years old. And so I think he thinks that he has to get started now on his big life project, which is restoring the territories, as he calls them, which means historic Russia, taking back Belarus and Kazakhstan and Ukraine as the core countries of that historic Russia, and then maybe let his successors expand beyond that. Part of it has to do with his age, part of it has to do with political opportunity. And what's more, to be honest, Ariana, Putin does not think that Biden is his match in terms of toughness and acuity. He doesn't think that Americans and Westerners are his match in terms of willingness to sacrifice. He thinks that when it comes right down to it, we're not going to be willing to do things like kick Russia off of the SWIFT payment system, which would induce it'd be way beyond what we've done so far in terms of sanctions, and it would really induce pain. It would probably throw Russia into a financial panic. It would really threaten Putin's hold on power. He's betting that rather than endure the higher gas prices and all the inconveniences that would be involved in that the American, West Europeans and Germans they're not going to sacrifice anything for this. He sees in Biden a relatively weak leader. He sees the same thing in Europe, and he sees in Western publics softies who aren't sticking up for their own countries, even on January 6th. He thinks he can outclass us. The question is now whether he's right or not.
So I think you brought up a couple of interesting points. I want to kind of talk about this concept of having a weak leader. Do you think it's mostly, well, a couple of things. Number one, what do you have to say about the sanctions that were on? This is just me playing devil's advocate. There were sanctions on the gas pipeline under Trump's presidency. That's something that Ted Cruz also really was like, I was one of the main people that put that. So, what do you say to people that would argue that like, well, Trump wasn't actually Putin's best friend. He did imply some sanctions on him. This is just me playing devil's advocate as well.
Sure.
And another thing is that I want to kind of dive into the weak leader concept. um Biden is, he does look like a weak leader, but does this also have to do with the way that people are looking at us now, as well as a country as a whole, after the way that we pulled out of Afghanistan and how the 20-year war against Afghanistan was essentially pointless, and we lost, like very obviously lost. Do you think that could also have something to do with it?
Yes, yes, and especially with the withdrawal from Afghanistan, Putin would respect the United States getting out of there because it's a drain on us and it's not doing our aims any good anymore.
Hmm.
But the way it was done, this incredibly sloppy way it was done, and the naive assumptions that the Biden administration was operating on when it did it, the assumption that the government of Afghanistan, which was our creation and which we propped up, would
Hmm.
somehow continue to fight on for another year, even though they knew they were going to lose to the Taliban after we left. Why would they do that? Once the United States is gone, they can save their own lives by just melting away. Our assumption that we didn't even have to get our own people out, and the tens and hundreds of thousands of Afghans who actually been helping us and believed in our ideals and wanted girls to go to school and everything else. We hadn't made plans for getting them out of the country. Struck Putin as sheer idiocy. And that helped him, that reduced his estimate of what the Democratic administration and Biden are capable of. So you're absolutely right that that could have made a difference.
And what would you say to the people that would say, well, Trump put imposed sanctions on Putin in some aspects. He wasn't
Putin,
indeed his best friend.
Trump, Trump didn't impose any meaningful sanctions on Putin.
Mm,
Trump was, after the election, Congress wanted to impose sanctions for the interference in the election.
mhm,
Trump, I think it was, the vote was in the House was something like 300. There was three dissenting votes. Everybody voted for it. In the Senate, it was almost unanimous as well.
mhm,
Trump sweated that out because he did not want to sign a bill to sanction Putin. He had to sign it because he knew it was going to be overridden by a humiliating veto. When it comes to the sanctions on Nord Stream, there's hardly any real sanctions on the Nord Stream pipeline. Its construction continued. Germany continued with it. Trump didn't really do anything against Nord Stream, and everybody knew that he wanted to lift all the sanctions on Russia
mhm,
that had been imposed by Congress after Putin took over Crimea and these cities in East Ukraine that he conquered in 2014. So Trump's argument that he was harder on Russia than Obama or harder on Russia than Biden, it's just false. And Putin's the one guy who Trump never criticized. You go to these international meetings. Think about the Helsinki meeting in 2018, where
mhm,
he just visibly sucked up to Putin the whole time. I mean, it's
mhm,
just embarrassing.
mhm,
That's gold for Putin. That's gold for Putin. He threatened the Western alliance, that NATO isn't needed anymore. He actually repeated Putin's talking points that he got from him in conversation in some cases. This was gold, and he didn't impose any meaningful sanctions on Russia anytime. So, and the Democrats need to know that and fight back against this narrative. And also, in my answer to your last question, make clear that if Putin were restrained in going into Ukraine or rebuilding the empire by Trump's presidency, it wasn't because Trump was so tough. It's because Trump was such an asset that he didn't want to embarrass Trump.
So, going off on that, I guess I don't know. I mean, so Biden is now imposing sanctions. I think universally everyone agrees that the sanctions is the best answer for now. What do you think about his response and the sanctions? Do you think the sanctions will work? Because I mean, so far they haven't. So.
They're not going to, as long as they're strictly financial sanctions, and as long as they don't really go after Putin's power, which is what he cares about more than anything, as long as they don't include economic threats that really threaten to throw then honestly, he's so motivated to do this, and he's so mindless of economic sanctions, and he's developed such a war chest. Russia now has $600 billion in foreign currency reserves to use on this war if they want to. It's
Mm-hmm.
becoming clear Putin's been saving for war, not just putting money aside for a rainy day.
Mm-hmm.
These kind of the sanctions we've announced so far, the symbolic sanctions today of sanctioning Putin and Lavrov, come on, we should have been sanctioning those two characters long ago. What I suspect is we do have tougher sanctions in our back pocket. And I do think that if Putin's move on Ukraine is so brazen, so inhumane, so outrageous that I think even people in Germany and other countries in Italy and France to some extent who've not wanted to exclude, to undertake these hardcore sanctions like excluding Russia from this SWIFT international payment system are going to start seeing, wow, I mean, maybe we should pay a price for this. So I would say so far, though, that Biden has done several things right.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, he's held together the Western alliance. This is remarkable. He's actually brought this peacenik lefty coalition that's in charge of Germany now, that's left since Angela Merkel left as chancellor
Mm-hmm.
a few months ago, and he's told the new chancellor, Chancellor Scholz, that he really expects him to be on board. And Chancellor Scholz's thing is climate change, and when he's a natural dove. He's kind of a peacenik. He doesn't want bad relations with Russia or anybody else. Biden has prevailed on it by saying, look, we got to hang together. We guarantee your security. Our nuclear umbrella has kept you safe for 75 years, and we want to keep that going. We need a healthy, united Western alliance. That's really good. And he brought him around. Brought him around on shutting down the Nord Stream pipeline 2 deal. He's made sure that the French stay in place. He's taken advantage of our really good relationship with Great Britain. Done a good job in that respect. He's also not given in to any Putin's concessions. He's never entertained them, which is the only way to go. Putin's demands, if we met any of them, would totally discredit the Western alliance and leave our allies in Europe just,
Mm-hmm.
open to Putin's invasion. So Biden has never done this dance about, yeah, maybe we'll meet your demands. He's been very strong in that respect. He's done a
Mm-hmm.
third thing that no other president's done to the best of my knowledge, is that he's fighting back in the information war in a very positive way. He is releasing intelligence as soon as we get it that show things like films of their false flag operations where Putin's going to pretend like there was some genocide going on in the cities that, in eastern Ukraine, and show these ridiculous, bogus videos. We actually get a hold of those videos in advance. We publicize them and say, well, here's what he's going to try to do. And then he can't do that. And, we found British intelligence found evidence of the guy, they found out the identity of the guy Putin wanted to put in power in place of President Zelensky after they execute their coup against Zelensky. And he's this clown. He's like this crazy guy he's totally unpopular and unknown in Ukraine. What that video showed is Putin and his people have to dig so deep to find a traitor in Ukraine, a puppet who would do their bidding. It's just embarrassing for Putin. And now Biden is doing something the Democrats have failed to do against Trump and failed to do against the Republicans. Usually our reaction to their lies and their crazy alternate reality is just to sternly fact check them. Show that it's not true what Trump said this and count his number of lies. But by the time we get done checking our facts, Trump's off to another set of lies. And he doesn't care. He doesn't stop him. Now we're actually weaponizing the truth. We're using transparency and the truth to fight the information war against disinformation, against Putin's lies. That kind of aggressive use of transparency and the truth shows where democracies have an advantage. And it turns what Putin has treated as a disadvantage, which is how open our societies are, into an advantage. We're weaponizing the truth. We're telling provocative truths, and we're basically catching him in his lies. That's a huge, huge step. And I hope that Biden and the Democrats learn from this and undertake and keep that attitude when they're confronting Trump and the Republicans in 2022 and 2024.
Yeah, I think you brought up something interesting, which was discrediting the Western alliance, and I kind of want to dig a bit deeper in this. Um, so, what do you think this looks like for? What is your interpretation of what this looks like for America on a foreign and international relations front? Do you believe that I mean, you did allude to how Biden is doing the right job, but previously, up until now, I would even like to argue that we were the biggest, the greatest power in the world. I mean, we said anything, countries would listen to us. I mean, that was really the standard. This is, I would like to say, probably the first time, with exception to Iran and a couple of other countries that are just inherently defiant, that a country has just straight up said, no, your sanctions are, I'm going to do what I want to do. And a leader has said, I'm going to do what I want to do. Do you think that this is going to set a precedent for the future of our global and international relations, as well as to the fact that countries may just not look at us as the powerhouse that we used to be 50 years ago?
Sure, they already don't. I mean, the fact is the United States was one of the two big superpowers in the world during the Cold War. The Soviet Union was the other. China was rising, and and then in the post-Cold War world, there was this moment where we were like the hyperpower because the Soviet Union went away, and so it's kind of unipolar world, right,
Mm-hmm.
that you were referring to in the 1990s. But with China rising fast, that world already passed pretty quickly.
Mm-hmm.
It's obvious that China is now going to become our equal in economic power. They're building a nuclear arsenal that will match ours. So we're always going to have countries in the world that stand up to the US and don't want to do things our way.
Mm-hmm.
And that's probably as it should be. But rather than standing up to America's unreasonable demands or standing up and saying the Iraq war is wrong, which Putin and everybody else was absolutely justified in doing, what we see now is that there's been this great moral clarification in the world. Let me tell you what I mean by that. During the Cold War, there's some moral ambiguity. And look, all these big battles over the future of the world, like we're in now, are essentially moral battles. They're not just battles over interest, they're battles over domination and vision of the world order. And during the Cold War, there was some moral ambiguity. We used to even make fun of the term free world because we aided so many dictators that weren't free. And African Americans until 1965 weren't even guaranteed the right to vote.
Mm-hmm.
And the Soviet Union and Sovietized China, the People's Republic of China, oftentimes were doing things that we regarded as progressive, or lefties in our country would rightly regard as progressive in terms of gender equality, getting more women into the workplace, trying to promote radical socioeconomic equality
Mm-hmm.
while capitalism was creating more inequality here. When it comes to international conflict, our invasion of Iraq, this totally boneheaded thing, and which Putin fought back against, it created some moral ambiguity. The world wasn't just bad guys versus good guys, right? In
Right.
general, I think you could say we were probably on the better side than the dictators were, but still there's some ambiguity. Look at what's happened, Ariana, in the last, say, 15 or 20 years, right?
Mm-hmm.
The United States doesn't do Iraqs anymore.
Mm-hmm.
We're not occupying any country. We're not attacking anybody. Um, we seem to have learned the lessons of that.
Mm-hmm.
There's colonialism is dead, so you don't have Europe lording it over the world and lording it over developing countries.
Mm-hmm.
And what's more, we've made enormous progress, which we progressives oftentimes ignore because we're afraid that if we acknowledge the progress, that we'll get complacent or we'll be ignoring the people who are still hurting. When it comes to things progressives care about the most, which is basically gender equality, LGBT equality, and racial equality, right? We're passionate about those things. And during the Soviet era, Soviet Union could say, oh, we're the great anti-racist power in the world, which is kind of nonsense, but they didn't have a problem like we did with race. They could say that we're fighting class inequality and we're trying to advance gender equality. But over the last even 20 years or so, the United States has gone from having 2 female senators to 27 female senators. If you look at Joe Biden's cabinet, it's at least a third women, and it's a rainbow of the country and the world, right? If you look at LGBT rights, gay marriage is now legal in the schools my kids go to here in California. Teach them that it's an absolute disgrace to shame anybody according to the sexual orientation. Huge progress we've made just in the last 20 years or so.
Mm-hmm.
Meanwhile, on the other side, You've got, the revolutionary powers of the Soviet Union, China, have become the opposite. They swung from extreme left to extreme right. You've got Putin trying to restore a kind of 19th century world where great powers gobble up their neighbors just because they can to expand their territory. What's more, Putin is embraced at home, and his wannabes all over the world, including Trump, have embraced of a vision of intolerance for LGBT people. Look at what Putin's done in recent years as we made all this progress, right? So a few years ago, Putin signed into law what's called informally in Russia the law on slaps, which decriminalizes some aspects of domestic violence. It gives men the right to hit their women or their children as hard as they want once. It only becomes it's a misdemeanor offense at that point, unless she has broken bones and lacerations that she has to stay in the hospital to treat. Imagine that. Putin wants to become the spokesman for the anti-woke world. And this is the way he appeals to, the far right wingers here and the far right wingers in Europe, these other disgruntled people who feel like their own governments, by embracing gay rights, have abandoned them. In terms of gay and lesbian rights, Putin pushed through a law recently also that criminalizes what he calls homosexual propaganda. It's nonsensical, and what the law has done is to basically create an environment of open season on LGBT people. Now, in other words, on all the things we hold dear, these, the powers that are standing up to us, led by Putin and Xi Jinping, have become the very opposite of what we progressives and just Democrats with a small d around the world value. If you look at the people in the top rungs of power in these countries, they're all men in China. They're all men in Russia. The war council of 28 people, has one woman on it, and she's a token. She has no power. Look at our Congress. Look at the faces of the people who are now defending democracy and freedom in Europe right now. Foreign Minister Baerbock of Germany, the Prime Minister of Estonia, Prime Minister Kallas, the Prime Minister Šimonytė of Lithuania, the Foreign Minister of Great Britain, Liz Truss. These are all women in their 30s and 40s. That would be impossible in an autocracy. And so what we're seeing now is progress in countries due to the fact that we're democracies, due to the fact that we can talk about our horrible history and we can take ameliorative measures. You can't even talk about this stuff in autocracies. Also, look at the cast of characters that's lining up on both sides. It's more clear than it used to be. On one side, you've got Putin and all his wannabes, Donald Trump and Tucker Carlson, the guys who are actually advocating for Putin in this crisis. You've got Foreign Minister Viktor Orban of Hungary, who's another one of these autocratically minded, patriarchal, homophobic douchebags. You've got, the guy in Venezuela who's just rules through starving his people, the most corrupt ruler imaginable in the world. You've got the genocidal maniac in Syria, Bashar Assad. You've got now today the military junta that's killing people left and right that every Burmese hates. And Burma has expressed their support for Putin. Now, I've gone through an almost exhaustive list of those who are siding with Putin. On the other side, you have the believers in democracy, the believers in progress. You have the feminists, and you have LGBT rights people. You have people that actually are trying to do what we consider to be the right thing in the world. So one problem, though, on our side is we're not embracing that identity because we're afraid of calling ourselves the good guys, especially progressives. Like, we know about our own crimes in the past and even the present as well. And we think that if we celebrate our nation's accomplishments or celebrate the accomplishments of democracy, that'll make us complacent. We won't keep fighting. But there's a time to step back and say, look at all the great stuff we've done. Martin Luther King did this all the time. And he always made it in his arguments in terms of American greatness and American moral greatness. Contemporary liberals were hesitant to pick up the flag as we identify with our own imperialism. The problem is, if liberals don't pick up the flag, ethno-nationalists who think that the nation is just white people, or the nation is just people who are second or third generation Americans, The people who want to disempower women, people like Trump and the contemporary Republican Party, will pick up that flag and they'll use it for ill. So we've got to get more comfortable again with embracing our own, frankly, superiority. Look around the world. The president of China and his whole inner circle are men. The president of Taiwan, a democracy, is a woman. It's these kinds of things are possible in democracies, not elsewhere. And I think we need to own that and regain our self-assurance. Doesn't mean we're perfect at all. Like, this doesn't have to go together with stopping investing. What it has to go along with is a realization that, we got a choice here. Do we want to live under Trump and Putin, Xi Jinping, and these guys, our choosing, who lose power, who when they lose power, leave office, they respect democracy, and who are progressives. So this is part of the conundrum we face.
I have a question, and this is just me really playing devil's advocate again. I do agree with you, but I think, and I've been hearing, here's the thing. The reason why I have brought you onto my platform and other folks as well, I had another professor, the chair of political science at Cal State LA was on my channel last night. It's because although I am a progressive content creator, I like to admit when I don't know much of something. And so I don't want to become an overnight expert, which a lot of content creators do. A lot of the time they speak on things they don't know much about. And so
Right.
I try to like step myself down and bring on someone that I believe and that the other person like across me believes that they are qualified to speak on, which you very obviously are. And my questions come out of just wanting to know my viewers are also very confused. And there's also a lot of present day
Or
fear mongering going on as well. I mean, this goes on. This started essentially in 1990, and all of the media coverage is like today now, what is happening right now. But unless you know that historical context or the global context or the way that everything is set up, it's very hard to really understand why everything has amounted to what is going on now. But I do want to ask you this question. The countries that you brought up, Venezuela, Syria, would you say that the countries that support Russia are really the countries that have been systemically oppressed or somehow impacted by America's foreign policy and international
no,
relations?
no. I
No.
mean, the Burmese junta, the military regime in Burma, we appropriately applied some sanctions to them when they destroyed the democratic project in Burma and imprisoned all the democratically elected leaders there. I mean, that was
Hmm.
appropriate. And the Burmese didn't do that because of resentment against the United States. They did it because they weren't getting the super profits and able to extract as much from the economy to rob the people as much as they did before.
Hmm. Hmm.
I mean, the regime in Venezuela, I mean, since it turned autocratic, the United States has appropriately abandoned it. But before it was an autocracy, the United States was fine with the. I mean, Venezuela was a great democracy. It was one of the earliest democracies in Latin America. You can fight Hungary. I mean, Hungary. Americans have never been mean to Hungary. It's not like Hungary has or Hungarians have any reason to resent Americans because of our imperialism or because of
Hmm.
awful things we did to them.
Hmm.
So it's tempting to say, well, Putin might be an awful guy, but at least he's standing up to American imperialism. But that's not really what's going on here.
Hmm.
And what's more, we're not fighting to take over new territories or to run the world. We're just trying to keep Europe from becoming a house of war in coming decades. We're trying to keep this norm in place, which we violated with the Iraq War, but we now seem to be on board with. Is you don't just invade other countries without justification. And we're trying to defend our own values. We don't want to live in a world where the Putins and the Trumps and the other patriarchal assholes run the show. So it's first of all, I don't think the leaders who are joining Putin are necessarily aggrieved by the United States, except insofar as the United States is standing up for good things. So you've got to complete the list of clowns on Putin's side, you've got Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, the president of Brazil, who hopefully is going to be tossed out of office this year.
Hmm.
He's burning down the Amazon. He's burning down the Amazon forest to clear it for commercial development. The world
Hmm.
depends on this. Fighting climate change is intimately connected with the fate of the Amazon forest, burning it down. He treats native Brazilians, indigenous people in Brazil, not even as Brazilians. He's a total patriarch. He calls himself the Trump of the tropics. And, Brazil doesn't have that much, at least in recent history, to be resentful toward the United States about. It's just that they got a leader who wants to model himself on Trump. So in Brazil's case, too, this is not some reaction against American imperialism. It's just the fact that they've got a leader who wants to follow Trump and everything.
Hmm. I have a viewer
So
question. Yeah,
actually, who's on whose side here? We see
yeah,
that pretty clear. Please.
yeah. No, no, I'm sorry. It broke off. The connection broke off for a
Oh,
second, so
I
I
see.
thought I thought you were done speaking. Please go ahead. I don't
Hmm.
like cutting people off when they speak.
No, I've
But
said all I needed to on that. I've already said too much. I tend to
no,
babble. Interrupt me anytime you want to.
no, no. We're all here to hear you speak. My guest speaker last night was here for over 2 hours, and everyone was eating it up. They loved it.
All
Um,
right.
so I do. I have a. I think this goes into my own personal question as well, and this is a viewer question too. So we're seeing a lot of fear mongering around the coverage. I mean, nuclear war was trending for a bit. World War III has been trending. Um, and it's definitely a possibility, but how do you think that it's as big as a possibility as they or mass media people, society is making it seem? And do you think there's any possible scenario that um, this conflict could cause the US to join in with military force at any point?
It depends on how in this conflict, no, but it depends on how tough we are. And we as progressives have to just get this through our heads. And
Hmm.
it's a logic that we would obey, we tell our kids to obey. If a kid's being bullied if my kid's being bullied on the playground by this awful big kid who's treating him really badly, I don't tell him to I want to be a good Christian, but I don't. I don't tell him turn the other cheek and just worry that he's going to get even meaner than he does and meet whatever demands he has. We tell our kids, no, you have to learn to stand up to them. You have to make allies with other friends who are going to help you stand up to them and
Hmm.
fight for themselves. And you don't mire down yourself down in guilt because your kid did something wrong or he or she's not perfect. You teach them how to fight back against bullies. Putin is the classic bully. He pushes as far as he can. He's very insecure about his own manhood and his own position and his own place in history. And the only way to prevent escalation to the threat of nuclear war is to stand up to him here. There's no danger of nuclear war over Ukraine because the United States and Western powers have made clear we're not going to send troops in. We should support the Ukrainian resistance in every way we can, but we're not going to send troops into Ukraine. The problem is if Putin succeeds in Ukraine, and we don't make life miserable for him as he does this, immediately he will be on to putting pressure on a member of NATO. Now, according to the NATO treaty, all powers are obliged to treat an attack on any one of each other
Right,
powers in the alliance as an attack on themselves.
right.
So all Putin has to do is start screwing around with Estonia a little bit. This little neighbor he has who's a member of NATO. Move a few troops into there. That wouldn't be hard for him. Then, if the United States doesn't respond forcefully, even with the threat of nuclear war, the whole credibility of the Western alliance is gone because we're treaty bound to protect this country and we didn't do it. That's Putin's goal. So, here, obviously, perhaps ironically for many of us progressives, the way to avoid the big dangers is toughness. It's not allowing us, it's not giving him concessions and allowing him to have what he wants now. He wants us to believe that. And a lot of the stuff we hear about World War III and nuclear war, that stuff is put out by Americans sometimes, but a lot of it honestly is coming from Russian bots and trolls. And to try to create fear here, he's a master of that. He did that during the 2016 election with all the pollution of social media, with these fake posts that were designed to make people of different ethnic groups hate each other and us to lose our confidence in our own democracy.
Hmm.
I think the best way to avoid World War III is for Putin to be put in his place right now. What's more, on neither side right now do we have genocidal maniacs. Putin values his own life. He doesn't want war. He doesn't want a nuclear war. Same is true for Biden. Same was true, frankly, for Trump. Trump was too concerned with his own survival to start a nuclear war. I'm not worried about that in the short run. What I am worried about is that if Putin actually escalates, if he wins in Crimea, or he seems to be winning, he's going to start putting pressure on members of NATO. And then we're going to be involved in what could be a nuclear showdown. I wouldn't even expect that to lead to a full exchange of nuclear missiles, but it becomes more of a possibility.
That's very interesting because the guest last night was convinced that not that he's wrong or right. I'm not questioning his intelligence, but the guest last night was convinced that Putin only wants access to Ukraine because he believes that Ukraine was always rightfully his, and he doesn't necessarily have an interest to expand. But from what I'm hearing from you is that you believe that, and this is all political analysis, right? There's no one correct political
Sure.
analysis, but your analysis is more so he wants to expand into kind of like a dynasty in that region.
Well, I mean, what you said is consistent with what I'm saying. He thinks Ukraine's part of Russia, and so he wants to
Right.
conquer it again. Well, the thing is, Ukraine is not, it's been part of Russia, and they've been part of the same empire for many years, and they were together in the Soviet Union. But it's been 30 years since they were the same country, and Ukrainians have their own culture and their own civilization and their own way of doing things. It's close to Russians in many ways. I guess the difference between, I don't know, Americans and Canadians. I mean, but we wouldn't be justified in surrounding Canada and invading it, taking it over,
Right, right.
and annexing it to our country. What's
Absolutely.
more, and Putin and that's what Putin's doing. Honestly, it's that crazy. It's
Yeah.
that crazy. Ukrainians are foursquare against this. Ukrainians used to be completely pro-Russian and vice versa. They didn't want any travel restrictions. They wanted their own country, but they weren't anti-Russian.
Hmm.
Till 2013, in fact, you see that Ukrainians' attitudes towards Russians and even toward Putin were very positive. And then Putin, you know, invades and annexes Donetsk and Luhansk in the east, creates a refugee problem that displaces 1.5 million Ukrainians, kills 14,000 Ukrainian civilians over the last 8 years, and turns the Ukrainian economy into a wreck. Now, is that the way to win a country over? On the contrary, Ukrainians have all become patriots. They've all become virulently anti-Putin. And so, Putin's whole attitude, marry me or I'll kill you, doesn't charm anybody in Ukraine. And so he hasn't been able to if he can't bring them around just with the force of his argument that you belong to us and we belong together, he's
Hmm.
decided to just crush the Ukrainian people.
Hmm.
Now, you know, I think that getting Ukraine back is the first step, and he thinks, or the second step, he's already got Belarus basically back, in reforming this empire. Now, if you think that Russian empire is justifiable and Ukrainians and Georgians and Armenians should just have to live under Russian occupation, then I guess you can go along with Putin, but that's his plan. And I don't think that he's trying to return to a kind of 19th century world of empires. That's his idealized world. There's like 5 big powers in the world, and they pretty much take all the territory around them. That's not a world we want to return to. It's certainly not a progressive world.
Yeah, but you do believe that he will escalate this as much as he can, essentially, is what
I
I'm
think
hearing from your
I think
analysis, and I could be
he'll
wrong. Please correct me if I'm wrong.
he'll escalate less or stop escalating at all as soon as he hits resistance, as soon as his own power is threatened. And that means the economy has to be seriously threatened, not mamby-pamby sanctions that we've done so far, but like the SWIFT account section, the ban on excluding Russia from SWIFT. And some of our economic sanctions introduced in the last 2 days have been pretty muscular. Like they
Yeah.
really are. Some are just symbolic though, like sanctioning Putin and Lavrov, the foreign minister. But Biden's holding some things in abeyance. He's holding some things back. He wants to deliver these sanctions slowly. And that's probably a smart move, but he has to make sure to keep the whole Western alliance
Hmm.
on board with that. Um, and so the key to avoiding the kind of conflict that we do not want means not returning to Putin's world and not respecting his desire to take over neighboring nations that want no part of being part of Russia. Most recent opinion survey you saw shows that 6% of Ukrainians are okay with the idea of joining Russia, and 94% say no. It's pretty clear. Country of 40 million people, ordinary civilians are arming themselves. The army has just opened up its weapon supplies to the population. Civilians are going to army depots and they're getting machine guns to take home with them and use. Putin's going to have to fight this battle house to house, and it's going to take years, and it's going to cost hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian lives. We've already seen 100,000 refugees from this war in the first 2 days. Poland is readying for 1 million refugees from Ukraine. Do we want to return to that world? I mean, is that the ideal world we want to be in? So Putin can have his fantasy, execute on his fantasy. And by the way, they don't want it. I mean, the data I've seen show that Russians are actually very unenthusiastic about this war. They get Putin's propaganda 24/7 about the fascist government in Kiev, trying to, let Americans come in and infiltrate Russia and harm Russia. And here the government of Kiev is basically liberal Democrats, imperfect ones. The president and the prime minister of Kiev, it's the only country besides Israel in the world where this is the case, are both Jewish. Ukraine actually sustained more deaths, as the president of Ukraine, President Zelensky, pointed out in his address to the Russian people in Russian language a couple of days ago. Ukraine incurred far more deaths than people in the Russian part of the Soviet Union did on a per capita basis fighting Hitler. Ukraine was ground zero in the kind of decimation of Russia, of the Soviet Union, by Hitler's forces. Zelensky himself also kind of has been saying all along, folks, I'm Jewish. Like, Hitlerian, you're going to have to get rid of me. And my grandparents, struggled and died in World War II as well, protecting the Soviet Union. Putin's claims are so manifestly ridiculous. The only people who possibly believe them are these people who he indoctrinates 24/7 and who watch nothing but Russian state TV. That's mostly people in over 40, 45, right? And especially over 50. Most people your age actually get their information out in Russia through Telegram channels and through social media. And they don't believe, they see more than Putin's absurdities, and they get to see actually the truth about what's going on too. Putin is afraid of that. He's afraid of popular resistance at home. I think this is going to be the tombstone of Russian power, or Putin's vision of Russian power, because I don't think he can pull this off, provided the West stands with Ukraine.
That's very. I was going to ask a question, but I'm actually going to ask a different question now. Do you believe that this is going to start like a significant amount of internal conflict within Russia to where it will be the demise of Putin? Because I would like to bring up, Iran. I'm Iranian. I lived in Iran for a year. I was there when the Greenpeace protests happened. Did not, every single time something starts, it's shut down.
Right.
Because the CIA, the monitoring is just so strong, and so it's just really strong and
Well, in this
ample.
case, it wasn't if you were there during the Green Revolution in 2011, that wasn't the CIA putting down the
Oh,
demonstration.
no. I know. But I'm just saying, like, in other countries that have tried to do this, like do live in a authoritarian-esque government, it's very hard for them to do. And so, do you believe that that could actually happen successfully in Russia?
It depends. Putin has completely destroyed his opposition in Russia. He took Alexei Navalny's group, he was the best democratic organizer, and he was also publishing outrageous stuff about Putin's corruption, putting up on YouTube. We know what happened. Putin tried to kill him, to assassinate him with poison. Then Navalny was actually able to get to Western Europe for treatment. And he's such a brave guy. He said, I have to go back to Russia. He knew he was going to end up in some horrific prison somewhere, but he went back anyway. So, Putin has encountered in Navalny and some of his supporters really irreconcilable opposition to his imperialistic, regressive vision. But Putin has pulled up the tracks on Navalny's organizations. The Anti-Corruption Foundation is what it's called, and driven their opposition underground or abroad, or arrested them and detaining them. That said, what we saw even in the last day or two in Russia since the war started was crowds of people standing in streets of all over Russia.
Yes, that's true.
just declaring no war. This isn't
True.
like saying no to Putin, bring Putin down, we hate him. You can just be revolutionary right now by saying no war. And that's no war with
Absolutely.
a neighbor who we love. It's like making the case for against war with Canada on the part of the United States. It's an easy case to make, and it's going to be hard for Putin as those voices multiply to arrest all those people. What do you
Hmm.
charge him with? They're against the war. He could try. He can try, but that as things get worse in Ukraine and people start discovering more of the truth, and it dawns on them that they're the aggressor, that Putin's the aggressor, and it's not a fascist regime. It's which most Russians don't believe anyway. It's a little democracy that's trying to like live its own life.
Hmm.
The more you're going to get these anti-war protests, that seems dangerous to Putin. But what Putin fears even more than popular uprisings is because they don't really pose an immediate threat is division among his cronies, his elite, who he surrounded himself with and shares, some bits of power with in order just to get the job done, right?
Hmm.
All these guys who he's made billionaires. Among them, he retains his authority only by being really popular with the general public. So these guys know if they try to move against him and steal his pile and throw him out in a palace coup, that they'd face some popular resistance, that Russia might not be governable because, a guy who most Russians or a lot of Russians preferred to rule them who's been thrown out of power.
Hmm.
He also can't ever appear weak with them. And if the response to his ridiculous, crazy invasion of Ukraine is that their fortunes start declining, which is
Hmm.
already happening. The Russian stock exchange has crashed over the last week, which
Right.
is costing all his cronies billions of dollars.
Hmm.
They're now threatened with being cut out of the international financial system. And all these guys have residences in the West. They spend most of their time in Europe and the United States. They don't want to be treated as pariahs. There's some possibility that if he appears vulnerable, or it looks like their fortunes would be much better off in a rule governed international order where they could actually not be treated as pariahs or denied visas to the UK where they stash all their money, the US where they buy up real estate, they might switch sides. And the United States should be very concerned with enabling that to happen right now. There's no way we can send CIA operatives into Moscow to take Putin out. We shouldn't do that. We can't do it.
Hmm.
That doesn't make no sense. But it does make sense to try to divide these forces he relies on to protect his money. His main money launderer, who lives in Switzerland, a guy named Gennady Timchenko.
Hmm.
2 weeks ago, his net worth was $26 billion. Now he has to get by in $16 billion. All right. It's hard to feel too sorry for Timchenko. $16 billion, I could probably live on that. But he
Right.
just lost like a third of his pile. And it was all due to Putin's warmongering.
Mm.
And so we should be working with oligarchs like that and saying, we can even sanction selectively. If they defect from Putin, there's no reason why we have to sanction them. We should be working on his officials around him who might be starting to see him as crazy and weak because this whole invasion, typically Putin only does, picks fights he knows he can win. He's got all his cards lined up and then he does it. This is a case where he's starting a fight that there's no guarantee he's going to win, and where his very sanity and like rationality seem to be eluding him. And the magnitude of his lies is so incredible. Like everybody around him completely sees it. A lot of Russians don't believe it. That makes him seem weak. And if he starts experiencing setbacks in Iraq, he has reason to fear that some of those elites around him are going to defect. Once that happens, he's in trouble.
Right, because then it would be internal conflict
Like,
within his own
like
peers.
exactly.
I want to ask you this question. It seems like you're really knowledgeable on this aspect of this conversation. You're knowledgeable all around, but it just seems like I haven't asked this from anyone else, and I think you would be the best person to answer this question. What does this mean for American politics internally? I mean, you brought up Trump, Tucker Carlson multiple times. You brought up progressive, politics as well. What will this mean for our internal politics in America?
Depends on what the Democrats do with it. Look, we blew it during Trump's time in office in 2018 when we discovered all these awful things, these contacts he had with Putin and how they were working hand in glove. And the Democrats made the mistake of saying, let's leave it to the lawyers. Remember, Senator Durbin, the number 2 guy in the Senate, even said, let's not politicize this affair. Well, if the Democrats aren't willing to politicize treason, then we're making a political mistake and a moral mistake. Let's leave it till Mueller. And then when Mueller's report was just another kind of like, bureaucratic report that was all about rules and regulations, when the Attorney General blacked out a third of that report, the stuff that would be embarrassing to Trump, we just kind of dropped it. Now, this is our chance. Trump has been a Putin wannabe and actually served Putin personally, his interests. He's the only guy Trump never criticizes. He worships Putin. Now he's calling for a Russian invasion of Ukraine. He's saying, oh, we got to do the same thing on our border territory with Mexico. Insanity. His former Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, is saying he's on the Ukrainian side, but he keeps lauding Putin as his genius and statesman. And then you got Tucker Carlson, the second most influential Republican in the country, just siding with Putin's imperialism. And, this is our chance as Democrats, large D Democrats and small D Democrats, everybody believes in democracy, to tether Trump. He's already doing it for us. We just need to tether Trump in people's minds to Putin, who's the world's most anti-American, anti-progressive dictator. Tucker Carlson, to tether their identities to this monster, right? The most anti-American, anti-liberal forces in the world, make clear that they're on the same team. And look who else is on the same team: the Burmese junta, the genocidal regime in Syria. It's all the bad guys are up on their side versus the guys who were totally imperfect. We've done all kinds of awful things, we liberals, but the fact is we have a vision for America that's very different from theirs. Tucker Carlson broadcasts programs from Budapest and treats Prime Minister Orbán's little dictatorship there as a model for the United States. This is a guy whose party went in and expropriated all businesses that didn't belong to his people and gave them away to his own people. A guy who's etched in the Constitution and this pro-life plank, who has been a Jew baiter. He's actually used anti-Semitism in Hungary. Tie all these folks together, because they're all on one side right now, and say, is this the America we want? Mm-hmm. Is this the America we want? Do we want to be ruled? This is the world we want. Do we want to be ruled by these folks? Or given the choice, would we rather govern ourselves? That's making it a very clear choice, and it's engaging in this moral battle, which we have to do. This is a moral question. It's not just a matter of interests and policies. It's a matter of who's right and who's wrong, and who wants to advance human welfare and who doesn't want to. We need to make that morally clear, and this gives us a golden opportunity to do it.
Do you think this goes to show how the right side would like to govern America if they got the chance, especially with the Don't Say Gay bill in Florida and other things that's been unwinding in America? Do you think Putin is kind of like their dream
Yes.
outcome? Okay.
Yes. He is. They love all his so-called traditional value stuff, and he's the ultimate badass, and he doesn't respect anybody else. He's really cocky. He's just the kind of ruler that these guys want. So are we going to continue to allow him to be like the biggest, what in the world, right? Mm-hmm. Or are we going to stand up to him and say, no, we liberals are slow to rouse and we're not natural nationalists. But when our values are under this kind of duress, when our picture of what a good society is under duress, we're going to become patriots, and we're going to stand behind the progress we've made and the vision we have for the world. We're not going to leave the flag with autocrats and would-be autocrats like Trump and Putin. We're going to stand up for our own values. And I think this is absolutely crucial to our cause, because we're in a long-term ideological battle in this world between the forces of, it seems like I'm simplifying, but that's our job as political scientists, kind of see the big picture. Between, I'm not going to say good and evil, but it gets pretty close to that in the world right now. And I think we liberals have to recognize that and own the fact that we're on the right side. We're imperfect. We should continue to examine very closely the crimes of our past and our present, which isn't even possible in an autocracy. But if we treasure the right to investigate the dark chapters in our history and embrace reform, we have to live in a democracy where candidates lose office and they leave elections, where there's a possibility of advancing the rights of LGBT people and women, a country where women are actually have access to the top positions of power. If we value that enough, we're going to draw together and we're going to defend it. And so far, we haven't done a very good job of that. We distrust nationalism and patriotism. We're always unsure of ourselves. We always want to see it the other guy's way. It's kind of a natural impulse on the part of liberals. And we see our crimes more clearly than we see anybody else's crimes. Those are virtues. But in times like this, you need some unity around your own principles. And you need to treat it as the moral ideological battle that it is. And I think that's the challenge we face now as progressives.
And how do you think the media is I hate saying the media. How do you think the news source is really responding to the conflict right now? I mean, like I said, like, World War III, nuclear. Do you think that we should, as a society, kind of sit back and wait and see how this unfolds, or do you think all of the fear is completely warranted? I mean, it's a pretty scary
I think
time right
I
now.
don't think we should step back and let it happen. I think we should
Hmm.
be bombarding our elected representatives that and praise for President Biden for standing behind freedom and peace in Europe and in the world as a whole. Unfortunately, the Republicans have a richer and denser civil society than we do right now. That's part of why elected representatives grossly overestimate how far to the right the average voter is. Brilliant article by David Brookman, who's one of my colleagues here at Berkeley, came out recently, and he showed that Republicans actually and Democrats in office tend to grossly overestimate how conservative their constituents are. Why is that? Because they get more calls from conservative constituents. They get more demands for meetings with conservative constituents because they're the ones hammering them. So, and of course, if politicians really knew, our elected leaders knew that we weren't as conservative as they think they are, they change their policies. So, we liberals need to unite and make some noise over this. They're beating us, our civil society, in this. This is our chance to actually see things really clearly and to organize against this common threat that we've all got right now. So I think this actually could redound to our benefit. But we have to, liberals hate this whole us versus them politics. We don't want to declare anybody beyond the pale. But look, I got news for you. There's all politics is us versus them. If you're not willing to call your foes and treat as the other folks who are trying to bury your democracy, folks who are trying to take away liberties, Ron DeSantis in Florida, Donald Trump, Tucker Carlson, if that's your idea of, if that's the kind of, if we're not willing to stand up to them, then it just becomes very difficult for our cause. And they're all lumped together on one side right now.
I know you have 5 more minutes, and I hear your alarm going off. So I do want to kind of like I want to be respectful of your time. I would love to have you on again, by the way, if you're down.
I'm down.
I have had
Love it.
the most viewage that I've ever had. We have about 100 people watching us right now on TikTok
Great.
and Twitch, so lots of
Well, hello to
viewage.
all your
People.
viewers. I'm honored to have the chance to come on Ariana's show and
Oh, thank you.
share my thoughts. And you said I'm such an expert on these things, Ariana. I don't know what the hell's going on. Anybody, what's Putin going to do? I mean, I've made some guesses and been right some of the times and wrong some of the
No
times.
one knows what's in
Even
his
somebody who spent
mind.
his whole life on this stuff doesn't really know. I just pretend to know.
They say that your hair looks great as well, so they
That's the
they love
important
you.
thing. Well, my mom's going to love it too for that reason.
They all love you so much. But I want to be respectful of your time. I know you've had a jam-packed day as well. I'm just so blessed and thankful that you were able to come on and we were able to speak to you. I know your time is valuable. And by the way, guys, such a cool person, CNBC, MSNBC commentator as well, and as well as a UC Berkeley professor. So just really accomplished all around. Um, but I do want to leave us with this question really. I think you brought up a very interesting point about American politics and the conservative dynamics within our democracy and the sovereignty that we live in. I believe that conservatives are much louder than actual liberals and left-leaning people are because like if you look at the statistics, most Americans are actually pro-abortion. Only about 30% of Americans are anti-abortion, and that 30% is so loud and funnels so much money into
Right,
anti-pro-life, anti-pro-choice lobbying and
right.
whatnot. So, do you believe that the response of how America deals with this could shift if the left-leaning constituents and people living, just civilians, people living in America, could change if we start voicing and we become just as loud as the conservatives in America?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. That's what I'm talking about. Our civil society has to be as strong as theirs or stronger. We have to accept the fact that politics is a dominance competition. It really is. It's not a conflict over this or that policy or building back better or not. It's who people think are the strongest, who people think are actually capable of really leading them and protecting them and keeping them safe. And the fact is Democrats have been on the defensive now for many years. And there's something about Trump being elected that really demoralized us. We're faced with what political scientists call the democratic paradox, which is the
Hmm.
possibility that the people might elect somebody who's going to undermine democracy. It's incredibly demoralizing to liberals because we want to think everybody's okay. They all like democracy like we do. Then we're faced with this leader who we don't know what to do with. It's nothing
Hmm.
but lies, hammering his opponents. He has no
Hmm.
policies. He has no interest in the nation as a whole. This
Hmm.
is incredibly disorienting and hard for us. But it's time for us to get over our actually stick up for our values and what we believe in and be more vigorous than they are about expressing and getting our views out there and treating them as the enemies of democracy that they are, not as people I come from Kentucky, right? A lot of the people where I come from are Trumpies, and a lot of them are very good people. They're not racists. So I'm not saying we vilify people as people. We vilify their public positions. These are folks who are trying to prevent our kids from wearing masks in school if the local school
Hmm.
district wants it. People want to spread COVID as a sign of their own, freedom to do whatever they want to do. These people are not our friends politically, and we need to treat them as foes. And we need to, frankly, not just outshout them, but out dominate them. We need to
Hmm.
ridicule them. We need to bring them down. We need to emasculate Donald Trump, not just say he's a meanie and say, oh, he's such a bully. Call somebody a bully that many times, you better stand up to him or you look weak. And that's what Trump plays on. That's what Putin plays on. It's time for us to basically, to get our self assurance back and to show them that the good guys might be slow to rouse, but when we are, we're out to win.
Absolutely, absolutely. And do you think people could do this by contacting their representatives or voicing their
Yes,
opinion on social media? Like, what do you think is the best
believe it
way?
or not, that stuff absolutely matters. It
Mm.
absolutely matters. When you're, I urge all our listeners, when you're on Facebook or Instagram or whatever, I'm old, like I'm on Facebook, I'm not on those other ones, TikTok, whatever you're on, um, you know, speak out in favor of Ukraine. I just changed I'm no Ukrainian nationalist, but I changed my image of my profile picture on Facebook to a Ukrainian flag yesterday. We're all Ukrainians now. This isn't about Ukraine versus the East versus the West. It's about democracy and liberalism and progress against its opposites in the world. So we need to get very serious about defending Ukraine. We're not just defending Ukraine, we're defending democracy and a rule governed international order,
Mhm.
which we violated many times. But we don't want it to disappear. So get involved. Write or call your congressperson. Write or call local politicians, local representatives as well. Make your opinion known. Spread the stories about the horrors in Ukraine. If it's not coming from Fox or some suspicious sources, if it's coming from CNN or NBC, repost it,
Mhm.
right? Join the Ukrainians in telling their stories. This is actually going to help a lot.
Interesting, interesting.
And be willing. And let me add this as a final point, Ariana.
Of
We,
course.
we have to we have to show that we're willing to sacrifice. If we really do the sanctions that would get Putin's attention and slow him down, it's going to involve real pain for us, especially for
Hmm.
people in Europe,
Hmm.
where Germans get 40% of their gas from Russia. If Germans are actually willing to put up with gas rationing and much higher prices for natural gas, we in the United States are not going to be as affected. We'll be affected a little bit. If we show that we're willing to sacrifice and we express our opinions in social media and media we might write op-eds for among our friends, to our elected representatives, that we are willing to suck it up and pay higher prices for gas and oil for a while. The Germans do the same thing, and the Brits, we're in a totally different world because Putin's betting the people in democracies are so soft that we're not going to endure any suffering at all if it actually affects our pocketbooks. Let's prove them wrong.
So let's prove them wrong by just accepting that price hike that this is going to give, as long as it does give, the Ukrainians freedom at some point,
Yeah,
fighting against
yeah.
Russia.
And make it clear that we support that, and we're not going to panic and back down on sanctioning Putin as soon as our the price of a gallon of gas goes up by 10 cents.
Absolutely. Listen, I would love to have you on here longer, but I know you are busy and I know you've been busy all yesterday and today with interviews and stuff like that. Um, but I really want to thank you for coming on and speaking to my viewers. We just want to know more than what the general news is giving us, and I think you
Yeah,
gave us an amazing summary of it. So
my pleasure,
they're
Ariane.
asking if you would like to come back. Like they're all asking that right now.
Absolutely.
Okay,
Sure.
amazing. Can we do a follow-up in a couple of weeks and kind of just touch base on the situation?
I insist on it. Absolutely.
Okay, perfect. I really appreciate it, Dr. Fish, and we'll
You
stay in
bet.
contact and have a great time to the next place that you're going.
Thank you so much. I
Of
appreciate it.
course, of course.
Have a
Have a
good
good
night.
one.
All
Thank
right. You
you.
too.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.